Hi, everyone. We're going to get started. Welcome to a very special edition of the Environmental Health Seminar. And my name is Tina Chen. I am an Environmental Health and Knowledge Translation Sciences from the National Cooperative Center for Environmental Health. And today we are very fortunate to have Dr. Craig Stephen, who is a professor at both the University of Saskatchewan and UBC, and the CEO of the Canadian Wildlife Health Cooperative, to talk to us about conservation as a public health strategy for climate change preparedness. Just a few housekeeping items for those of you on the phone. If you're joining as a group, please send me your names and email addresses through replying to the Eventbrite invitation email if you want to receive sci-fi educational credits. And during the question and answer period, please enter your questions into the chat box, and we'll get to them accordingly. So please help me welcome Dr. Craig Stephen.
Well, thank you for the invitation. Good morning to everybody in the room and to those of you online. I'll have to remember there's people on the phone as well as in the room here. It's really a pleasure to be back. This seminar actually started in the early 90s when I worked at BCCDC. And when I was there working in infectious disease epi group, Rick Mathias, who was a medical health officer and a faculty member out at UBC, said to me once, Craig, I know it's your job to worry about the health of animals and my job to worry about the health of people, whose job is to look at it together. And that was before the era of One Health, but it started down that track of thinking about how our health and the health of the world around us are intertwined. And we're going to talk a little bit about today to think about how conservation can be a public health strategy for climate change preparedness. This is the first thing I want to do. National Collaborating Center for Environmental Health, the environment is not scary. Most of what we do in environmental health is the bad things in the environment. Zoonoses and contaminants and injuries. I want to start reframing the environment as a positive determinant of health, not something that's just going to, I always like that red-eyed gull looking right at the camera. It's nice and frightening. So here's my proposition. Here's the idea of this whole seminar. For society, health equity is really going to be our cornerstone for climate change preparedness. But really, the determinants of equity lie beyond the social determinants. When we read about health determinants in public health, we almost exclusively talk about the social determinants of health. Climate change health equity has to be intergenerational, because it took us a few hundred years to get here. And even if we fixed everything that was causing carbon increase today, it would take just as long to get back to a normal climate regime as it did to get there. So if we fixed everything today, we're looking at over 100 years. So we have to think about health equity of intergenerational health equity. And to have intergenerational health equity, we really have to have interspecies health equity. In other words, we need a sustainable, resilient biosphere. And so I'm going to spend the next while trying to justify that proposition. So I'm suggesting we need to think about this as climate change health equity as a definition. All species across multiple generations can reach their full health potential and should not be disadvantaged from maintaining it because of climate change. So we have to have the fair and equitable distribution of resources for health and sustainability that balances the need for today with the needs for tomorrow by investing in and maintaining the social and ecological and environmental determinants of health. And really, that's the basis of the UN Sustainable Development Goals. You can't have a healthy economy without a healthy society. You can't have a healthy society without a healthy biosphere. And if you notice, that arrow going in the middle of them is bidirectional, right? So our well-being is founded on life below land, life below the sea, clean water, climate action. Those are critical sustainable development goals and really emphasize that interaction. Of course, this was described well several years ago in the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment. That's when another big UN panel tried to decide the state of our ecosystems and how they were going to influence our well-being in the future. And they came up with this diagram. So the environment provides support for everything we do. Nutrient cycling, energy cycling. If you believe in the thermodynamic definition of ecosystem health, that's all that matters. Nutrient cycle, energy cycles, doesn't matter if it's us or snails or slugs. But those supporting things provide us stuff like food and water and fuel. It regulates our climate, floods, disease, water safety. and it provides cultural support for many people. And those, of course, lead to many of the constituents of well-being: personal safety and security, basic materials for daily life, health, and good relationships, which of course then leads to freedom for choice. So the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment showed us how our freedom for choice depends on having options with a diverse, sustainable environment, which of course is just the Ottawa Charter for Health Promotion, right? The Ottawa Charter basically says the overall guiding principle for worlds, nations, and regions, and communities alike is the need to encourage reciprocal maintenance to take care of each other, our communities, and our natural environment. Now, I would suggest that the health promotion movement has largely forgot the last part of that sentence. Again, looking at the environment only as a source of harm, rather as that word of reciprocal care that is emphasized in the UN Sustainable Development Goals. And that, of course, is entirely consistent with the ethos of conservation. For those of you who have a background in ecology or biology, hopefully you've heard of Aldo Leopold, one of the most important fathers of modern conservation movement, where conservation is the state of harmony between man and land, which is really, I think, a rephrasing of the Ottawa Charter. Now, before we get any further, where I make the argument that conservation and public health are bonded, let me just take a second talking about that. Well, public health, what is it? Preventing disease, prolonging life, promoting health through organized efforts of society. Conservation biology, preventing the loss, protecting and restoring biodiversity by managing physical, ecological, and social factors. And both those diagrams show that they are multidisciplinary endeavors that require different people and different determinants to get the chosen outcomes that we have. So there's a lot of sort of conceptual similarity, particularly if you consider us part of biodiversity. So it's important to define what biodiversity is. It's basically all life, which includes us. I always tell people I never gave up my union card of being part of nature. So we are biodiversity. All the variety of life on Earth, as well as the communities that form and the habitats in which they live. And it's not just the number, but the variety of them. So we may have the exact same number of songbirds in Vancouver, but it's different if it was all starlings versus starlings and sparrows and swallows and a variety of different birds. So biodiversity is biology plus diversity. And climate change is a shared threat across what I call the healthscape. The healthscape, that place where health happens, where our health and the health of the world interact, instead of a landscape. So for example, here, this map represents a project we're working on in St. Kitts, the area called the Narrows, which is between St. Kitts and Nevis. Important for recreation, for fishing, but it's hugely important for nursery for endangered species, for sea turtles. They provide areas coral for fish habitat. And climate change doesn't pick one of those pieces of that healthscape to work on. It's affecting the mangrove, the fish, the recreational, the fisheries, all at the same time. So we've got to realize that climate change is a shared threat across the healthscape. So just take a quick sidetrack of what do we worry about when we talk about climate change? Where's the conversation generally go? So public health priorities, if you read Public Health Agency Sustainable Development Strategy, they talk about reducing vulnerability. And I think that's really important to think about vulnerability reduction as opposed to reaction to adverse outcomes as the focus in individuals, communities, and regions to climate change impacts. They emphasize infectious disease risks in that. Similarly, there's a report by the Chief Medical Health Officer in Canada at the Public Health Agency who wanted public health to strive to prevent and adapt to current, as well as anticipate unforeseen threats and identify the most vulnerable populations. So it's very clear that from a public health perspective, vulnerability is really important to be thinking about, rather than often the target of our surveillance, which is find the bad outcome and respond to it. We want to find vulnerabilities so we can protect them in advance of harm. And there's a suite of public health concerns that we talk about. What get most attention in public health are acute things, hot air quality, heat stroke, some infectious disease work, particularly vector-borne is the one we talk about. But you can see there are other things. I was just up in Yellowknife and ice roads are closing early. It's dangerous to get out on the land. Food security is declining because of wildlife changes. But public health often just focuses on those acute health outcomes. Agriculture is also talking a lot about climate change. Depending on the maps you look at, Canadian agriculture is going to shift significantly. Globally, though, there's a much bigger concern. Water. There's not going to be the water to feed, or not to feed, but to water the animals, particularly in places like sub-Saharan Africa. The Caribbean, droughts becoming more and more common. You need to get the water to the animals. They need to have food quality and quantity. Landscapes are going to change. Grasslands are going to change. Where can we have those animals that are still productive and not destroy the biodiversity? And then, of course, agriculture is also worrying about infectious diseases spreading and increasing productivity and safety of food. Conservation. Climate change is important, but acting in many different ways. These are just some examples. That number of 350 right whales has decreased, as you've probably seen in the news. More were hit by boats. The ones that were supposed to be giving birth this year weren't. That number is getting lower and lower, and they're having a hard time surviving because as water temperature changes, the small krill that they feed is changing in abundance and distribution. Loggerhead turtles, more and more females are coming up. The sex of reptiles can be determined by incubation temperature. If the sand that they're incubating is warmer, we're getting more and more females. Polar bears and penguins are both suffering from lack of ice and making it hard to find their food. So wildlife are being very acutely affected by climate change, by lack of some of those resources for daily living. And even at an ecosystem basis. I mean, we've heard lots in the news about the likelihood of increased forest fires, increased forest pests, changes in forest productivity, which will then not only affect the ecosystems, but the resources that people and communities depend on, whether that's forestry or fishing and hunting communities. Ecosystem change is going to have impacts on many social determinants of health. So what can we do? What can we do to be more resilient against climate change? And I think, as I say, that should be our goal in public health if we're really believing about health equity, is building resilience now for the next generation. And there's really three options: buffering against harms, reducing vulnerability, and giving more options to adapt. So there's a lot of discussion now about green infrastructure. I was at a meeting recently about sea level rise down in Florida. Florida's gone. I mean, Florida is only 3 feet high at their highest elevation, and they're getting tides that are going further and further inland. So they're looking at more engineering solutions to deal with this. How can we have green infrastructure in our cities, not just build, concrete dams and metal bridges, but things like having marshes. So they recognize that in New Orleans, if they had functional marshes, they would have really dampened the effect of storms and flooding. Similarly, mangroves in tropical areas, a complex mangrove ecosystem decreases the energy from things like high tides and waves, buffering coastal communities against floodings, buffering against increased storm events that we're seeing. Similarly, planting trees in cities. There's many values of urban forests, but some of them for climate changes, they are going to improve air quality, so reducing some of the concerns with air quality. They cool cities, right? They were creating green spaces to decrease urban temperatures. They manage stormwaters to keep pollutants out and reduce flooding. In fact, in that Florida meeting, some of the engineers were suggesting if they planted trees not in the streets, but on the sidewalks, and the amount of water that they could absorb up would hugely decrease their flooding risks and wastewater issues. So green infrastructure is something we haven't invested enough in Canada, but has many fans for how it can help protect urban centers against climate change. And certainly trees themselves, green things that grow, that absorb carbon and use carbon, are a great buffer against climate change. Planting forests, planting trees, take carbon dioxide out of the air and store it in there. As we cut them, as we burn them, as we log and pave, we release that carbon back into the atmosphere. So green living plants, the oceans, all these sorts of things help absorb a lot of the carbon dioxide and can buffer us against those changes. A functional ecosystem is really important for watershed protection. As we see watersheds get more and more damaged, their ability to absorb runoff, to control floods, to maintain water quality are decreasing. And I remember it was just after my BC CDC days, when there was the outbreak of toxoplasmosis in Victoria from watershed. I see some nods, people remember that. Well, my grad student was out there running around trying to figure out what animals had it. And at the end of the day, the working hypothesis is we found infected cougars in there. We found cougars pooping at the watershed edge. And we saw a storm event that likely washed those feces into the water supply. Now, less trees, less vegetation, less protected watersheds are going to have more of those fecal contaminations and other runoff. So not only do they decrease the effect of storms, but they also affect water quality by having intact, healthy, natural watersheds for source protection. So buffering is the one thing we can do. The second thing is, can we reduce our vulnerability? Right, what are we going to do that's going to keep that balance so we don't slide into those crocodiles of climate change and all the harms they can have? So just because we use words like resilience and vulnerability differently, I've got my definition up there as the propensity to be adversely affected, right? So our exposure and our sensitivity to the hazards and our lack of capacity to cope and adapt affect our vulnerability to something. So the big sexy thing around infectious disease and climate change is often emerging zoonoses. Let's make us less vulnerable to zoonoses. A picture on the side sort of gives the hypothesis that we have viruses circulating in wildlife. They spill over into domestic animals. They spill over into us. If we detect it early in wildlife, stop the spilling into agriculture, control that early, we can dampen the height of the epidemic in people. That's sort of the working hypothesis for many of these zoonoses, whether it's Ebola or Lyme disease or other issues. Can we control it at the ultimate source? But the question is, what kind of exposures are we signaling? If obviously I can't see people who are on the WebEx, but in this room, if I told you that a colleague of mine discovered a new coronavirus in a bat in Saskatchewan, how many of you would worry about that from a public health perspective? Knowing that coronaviruses are the source of many of our new emerging infections. I've asked that question at several meetings now and nobody raises their hand. What if that coronavirus was in Africa where Ebola is known? Right? So we don't often...
White nose syndrome is going to kill off all the bats.
White nose syndrome is going to kill off the bats, and that's going to cause forest pets. And we're already seeing for white nose syndrome, which is a pathogen of bats, increased cost of apple production in Nova Scotia because of pets. But that's a side argument. The issue is when we're trying to get signals of exposure, that's often the finding of a hazard is not enough to motivate people to act and change what they want to do. So the question is, what do we want to do when we look for signals of exposure? One question is it there? Can we detect hazards in the environment? So there's a colleague of mine swabbing a duck to see if pathogenic avian influenza is present. But we've recognized that when we talk to farmers, for example, and tell them we have this virus, it's insufficient to motivate them changing their biosecurity to stop it from spilling into poultry, to stop it from spilling into us. So they want other things they want to know, whether it's a pathogen, like so that coronavirus in bat, the question is, can it hurt us? What's the probability of harm? Can signals from nature tell us about possibility of harm? We have a much better track record of that with pollutants than we do with pathogens. But what evidence really inspires action? So that graph down below is the result of a project we did working with people who make decisions around avian influenza, whether they are chicken farmers or veterinarians or regulators, of what would get you to change your risk management behavior. And we found that, sick animals can inspire action in advance of harm, but often it's not enough. And so that group wanted to see things like, they wanted to know, would that duck that has that infection present a risk to my farm? Are there other ducks around? Are there many of them there? Is there standing water that will keep them there long enough? Is there ice on the ground so the water's not running off? So we began to start building these indices of, let's just call them intelligence, where we bring in multiple environmental clues to ask the people, is this particular location susceptible? To simply say there's a pathogen present wasn't enough to make them feel they were vulnerable enough to change their action. We needed information from the rest of the surrounding environment to do that. And I really want to emphasize that it is beyond zoonoses. If you look at our climate change concerns around public health, vector-borne is all there all the time, waterborne diseases perhaps. But if we look at what's going to happen with climate change, with melting permafrost, melting ice caps, changing distribution of wildlife, we are going to fundamentally change the way contaminants move around in the environment. And so pollutants are important as well. I mean, we see in the north how mercury is deposited up in the north. And then if you look at, for example, here on the coast, if you were to bury a killer whale, you almost need a toxic waste permit. They're that contaminated. They have so much contamination that's built up into them because they've eaten Chinook salmon for those residents who have bioaccumulated, biomagnified contaminants because they've got it from the zooplankton and they've got it from pollutants being dropped into our oceans. We have this mythology that the oceans are pristine. Our relationship with those contaminants are going to change as the distributions of species we hunt and fish out of the oceans change, and as contaminants are liberated as ice melts and water movement changes. So we need to think beyond zoonoses when we're looking at signals for harm from environmental clues. But at the end of the day, we really suck at prediction. I don't see there's some people who have modeled things to predict, but we're not good at it. We missed Zika. We spent how many millions of dollars trying to build infrastructure to miss Zika entirely. We overestimated SARS 100 times. We can't even really tell for sure what we should vaccinate for influenza from year to year. And right now we have a fascination with infectious diseases, but now it's shifting. Like I say, when I went to university, we were all going to die of pollution and nuclear war. We don't talk about that now. Well, now that there's been certain things happening down south, maybe we're talking about some of that a bit more. All right, and then it was infectious diseases. Now it's climate change. We have this disease I discovered called apocalyptic attention deficit disorder, right? We habituate to a harm and we move on to the next one. And we've never at the end got good at predicting a lot of these sort of unexpected diseases, despite millions. I mean, who would have thought of prions? I mean, when I went to school, aging myself, we never even thought of a prion. They didn't exist. To assume now that if you fed a cow to a cow, it would make us have a spongiform encephalopathy, who would have thought that's happening? So surprises are really common when we have complex socio-ecological systems, and climate change is one of the drivers of those socio-ecological systems. So here's why prediction is tough. Down at the bottom is the higher risk of human infection. And if you just scan your eyes over that slide and see all the things that are driving changes in human infection, and to suggest that where in that complex network, we're going to have an accurate predictor that will inspire action in advance of harm, and to recognize that that system for the Okanagan is going to be different for the system in Vancouver because of all these different drivers. Prediction is very tough. In fact, complexity science will tell you you can't predict because surprises are a normal part of complex dynamic systems. So if the question is, if we can't predict, can we be less often surprised? And it's very interesting if you look at the health literature, there's almost nothing published on surprise. The military talk about it, business talks about it, climate change is starting to talk about it, but we don't talk about the science of surprise. So I did sort of an inventory of what kind of surprises there could be and came up with this sort of taxonomy. We have rare events with serious consequences. No one really would have predicted that after the tsunami in Japan, we'd have a big nuclear fallout. There are common events we didn't recognize as signals. So nobody thought that first case of West Nile virus in the flamingo in the zoo in the States was the sign of the beginning of a new epidemic. Unexpected consequences. Who would have thought that New York's need to ship its garbage to Ohio would have caused a rabies outbreak in Ohio? Because there were some people in New York who said, I used to hunt raccoons when I was a kid, and that was fun. There's no raccoons here. Hey, there's a lot in Florida. Let's bring those back up and get raccoons going. Well, they brought up some rabid raccoons. Rabid raccoons are there. Raccoons are populating. Raccoons like garbage. Raccoons jump on a garbage truck. Garbage truck drives to Ohio. Raccoon jumps off. Who would have expected that sort of sequence of events to happen? And then finally, knowable consequences from an unexpected source. So in retrospect, it's quite logical how a prion disease could have happened, but we knew about prion disease in Creutzfeldt-Jakob, but we never really would have expected it from that agricultural food system. So those are sort of the four key types of surprises that we tend to deal with in health issues. And so what are our responses? For the first two, where we have things that are knowable in retrospect, but we didn't really see them, or we failed to recognize them to respond, the one strategy is to figure out, is a harm possible? And we achieve that by connecting various specialized pieces of information to see a hazard sooner. So this is why there's the interest in paying attention to pathogens and pollutant trends in animals. So we might see, oh, this potential thing's coming here. And in fact, tying the presence of those hazards to biological responses, the animals are sick, they're dead, they're whatever, help us anticipate a harm before the sick people. But we also need to track changing exposures. How has our food system changed? How has our importation system changed? How are we interacting with the environment? Some of the hemorrhagic fevers in South America were associated with forestation because we entered new ecosystems. Should we be aware of those changing things? And try to find clues of harm in other contexts. Where have we seen this before? So for those type of surprises, that's important. Can we get clues from other analogy by connecting information? But for the unanticipated, inconceivable events, the real question is, can we deal with it? Because we're not going to anticipate them. There's no analogy out there. So how can we track sensitivities to change in determinants of health and our capacities to cope by taking a cumulative effects perspective? So some examples of using wildlife as biosentinels of vulnerability for climate change, we can see when we can map them across public health concerns that have been listed for Canada. So certainly for vector-borne diseases, they can show pathogen and vector distribution, but they can also show changing environments. So there are vector-borne diseases of wildlife that are not zoonoses, but they're changing distribution. They're showing that the vector environment is changing. So there's a culicoides-associated disease of deer. Won't make you sick. We're starting to see it in Ontario. We're starting to see changes in winter tick on moose in different parts of the land. So we're seeing the vector landscape changing by paying attention to what wildlife are getting. Food and water safety, certainly again, finding infectious and non-infectious hazards in the environment. Fish are used quite often as a source of public concern or assurance around contaminant input from the tar sands up north, for example. Right? So we can start to see what's out there by sampling the animals, biosentinels of the hazards, but they also play a big role in providing consumer confidence for food safety. In rural and remote Canada, wildlife are still a critical part of food safety. The government of Nunavut has said wildlife health is a cornerstone of their food security strategy. Understanding the presence, the quality, and the abundance of wildlife will be critical to maintaining access to country foods as well as commercial seafoods. Mental health and social cohesion. We did a project a little while ago for the First Nations Health Authority, trying to think about the relationship between ecosystem health and community well-being. The connection to the land is critical determinant of First Nations community health. And that relationship to the land can be an extractive one, where we're hunting or fishing, a family cohesion one, where they're out with the kids in the bush, or let's just call it a spiritual one, where it fits people's worldview. But we also see increasing evidence of the importance of green spaces for mental health and well-being for people in urban centers, and access to seeing wildlife is something that can tremendously decrease mental health problems in stress areas. Not so much as a value for looking at infrastructure effects or extreme heat, though. So nature has impacts on climate change vulnerability. They provide sources and signals of exposure. They affect our adaptive capacity and our sensitivity by affecting our social determinants of health. Animals provide food, they provide income, they provide cultural support. There's lots of evidence showing that they are really important for our well-being, from the mental health issues to things like food security and water safety as well. So an example of salmon climate change in us. Fraser River, water's getting warmer, fish are cold-blooded. Their energy is based on the outside temperature, so they start burning up more energy. Some of those salmon, when they come back, have to swim 2,000 kilometers upstream before they can lay their eggs, so their energy resources are important. As they move up, because not only their metabolism, but their pathogens metabolism is water temperature dependent, infectious diseases become more of a problem. They start dying sooner because of exhaustion and infection, and they don't get up to spawn. Well, so what? Salmon are a hugely important determinant of health and well-being for many British Columbians and for many Canadians. We all tell people to eat more fish, it's good for your heart. We tell people to get out. Recreational fishing is huge. Recreational fishing, a recreationally caught fish is worth way more than a commercially caught fish because people invest in the community. They buy fishing licenses, they buy gear, they buy guides, they buy hotels. They really can contribute to community income. Unemployment, we've seen what's happened with the fisheries decline. When I was in high school, back in Stevenson years ago, you went fishing for salmon in the summer and hadn't had enough money to buy a Trans Am when you got out, because Trans Ams were cool when I went to high school. Now those same fishing boats go out 2 days a year to catch fish. So we've changed employment conditions. For many First Nations commissions, social cohesion comes around that annual event of gathering food for the community. Aquaculture and commercial fisheries play a huge part in our food production economies in British Columbia. And so you can see that many of those determinants of health are impacted by the presence of an abundant, healthy, safe, and secure salmon. So biodiversity is hugely impacting our social determinants of health. We just have to stop and remember what happened when cod collapsed in Newfoundland. When the cod disappeared, the jobs disappeared. When the jobs disappeared, neighborhoods fell apart. Civic infrastructure disappeared. Social context and community connectivity went down. Our living wages went down. People had to travel further to catch different fish, more occupational risk, increased alcoholism, family violence, and decreased feelings of well-being and mental health because we didn't pay attention to the biodiversity that those communities depended on. Communities that don't have that sort of help from biodiversity will be much more vulnerable to the impacts of climate change. And it's happening right now in the north. Up in the top right, you see the bar graph of the declines in caribou in the north. This is a tragic event. Caribou's food safety is declining because, again, with the remobilization of contaminants, we have to worry about that food being safe. This deer at the bottom has chronic wasting disease. The wild deer equivalent of mad cow, they're moving further north. We've already seen this disease spill over into reindeer in Norway, meaning that caribou will be susceptible. As caribou go down, food security, which is in a terrible state in the north, gets even worse. Income goes down because Inuit and Dene get plenty of income from people wanting to hunt those, and cultural security goes down. So it's not a hypothesis. We've experienced with cod. It's happening now. Well-being in communities decline as their ties to biodiversity decline. And so we know both sensitivity and exposure are going to change concurrently as climate change. In Arctic ecosystems, for example, as ice changes, it's not there as much, we're going to change which animals are there, which ones come to the shore, how they interact and share pathogens. We're seeing new diseases showing up, for example, in musk box right now. We see diseases of domestic sheep showing up on wild things because we're changing the way wildlife's interacting, and then we change how we interact with them. You know, at the same time, we're releasing the pollutants, we're having lower access to the determinants of health, so vulnerability is significantly affected. And while I'm focusing on more rural and remote examples, there are urban examples as well. It's important to understand vulnerability to target our climate change strategy. And I've always liked this diagram that I stole from somewhere quite some time ago. If we're in a situation where you are exposed, you're sensitive, and you can't deal with it, you're highly vulnerable. So that means our research and our actions have to focus on interventions. How do we reduce vulnerability before harm exists? If you are exposed and sensitive, but you have a high capacity to adapt to it, you're a potential adapter, you might be at risk, so we need to focus on maintaining your capacity to cope, those things that give you personal and community resilience. If you are exposed and can't adapt, but you're not sensitive, well, we need to look at the population and what's going to change your sensitivity to the effect. And finally, if you aren't exposed, but are sensitive and have capacity, we really need to focus on exposure, surveillance, and monitoring the environment. So understanding how vulnerability is changing as we change with our relationships to the world around us can make us more strategic in how we allocate scarce public health resources to better protect vulnerable communities. Resilience is an area where biodiversity and conservation and climate change seem to be best fit, because the idea of resilience and ecology is pretty much the same thing as health and population health. Now, as I said, I focus on rural and remote and First Nations, but we are all part of health. This book, Food, Sex, and Salmonella, his basic premise is sex is the most intimate relationship you can have with another human being. It gives us pleasure, it brings us risks. Food is the most intimate relationship you can have with the world around it. We take the world and we stick it inside us. It brings us pleasure, it brings us risks. But the fundamental premise of his argument is we are not separate from the world. We keep talking about man-made and natural. We are all still part of nature. But as Canada gets more urbanized, we lose our connectivity to the environment around us. I've got a dozen people in the room right here. Put up your hand if you've been to the watershed where you get your water on a daily basis. Okay, one hand went up. Who knows where your watershed is? Not even half the hands went up. Do we know where your food came from that you ate for breakfast today? Right? As we urbanize, we lose our intimate connections with the world around us, but they are still there, and we ignore them at our peril. Some communities have more regular contact with them, but our needs for daily living come from the ecological services that nature provides us. So a good example for that is seafood. Seafood are I like to call it the bush meat component of your grocery store. It's the only thing that we still go out and hunt and kill on a regular basis. But seafood is critically important for the world's poor. Most of the world's poor live in coastal areas, and many of them are dependent on seafood resources, which are declining tremendously. And we see there's going to be major challenges to fisheries. We're going to see that species change. We've got animals, fish coming into British Columbia that have never been here before. They're coming up with the warmer water. They're going to displace other species. Spawning times are going to change. So as salmon come out of the stream here in BC, because the river temperatures are warmer, that cues them to come up sooner, but the food in the estuaries isn't ready for them yet. That means they head up to the ocean with less fat on their bones to survive. We're seeing changes in phenology. We see that production can be limited because of growth rates. We see severities in storms and infrastructure. For those in BC who are dealing with things like Vibrio and norovirus and shellfish, with storms and runoff could be an issue. And of course, ocean acidification, which is a huge impact of climate change, will affect the fundamental food change in the oceans. So what do we do to protect that food access, those income accesses for people as climate change are fundamentally changing our oceans? Well, one strategy is marine protected areas. In Jamaica, I was there a while ago, and the community fishers are guardians of marine protected areas now. They ensure people don't fish because they've recognized you need to have a healthy, vibrant reef ecosystem to act as a nursery for the fish that they need to have. They've recognized we cannot keep extracting if we don't also protect. Their livelihoods will be destroyed, their incomes will be destroyed, and we'll have the cod incident all over. So marine protected areas, protecting biodiversity, is a strategy to build resilience in coastal communities against climate change impacts on our well-being. Biodiversity itself is going to help our food adapt. So we need to have biodiversity in crops that are able to adapt to different temperature regimes, the ones that can do better with less water, the ones that can manage different soil. Now, some of that's going to be genetically modified, but you still need to have the raw material genetics to modify it. Some of it will be adapting crops to particular areas. Similarly with livestock, which livestock are going to be more heat tolerant? So when we're working on a food security strategy in the Caribbean, what species of small ruminants will do best as the area gets drier and the food quality changes? And how are we going to be able to control pests and weeds and diseases by selecting for innate resistance? Fisheries, we're going to have to figure out what are the more abundant species, how to restore their habitats, and how do we deal with the infrastructure that we're going to take all those resources out with. So biodiversity is going to give us options to adapt for an unanticipated future. Because our capacity to cope is really about those, I like that word, the opportunity space. We have a world where we talk about climate change today, but there's multiple stresses. There's urbanization, there's globalization, there's all sorts of these things happening together. We need to have a cumulative effects approach to these, but we need to have options to adapt, right? We need to make sure that we have variety, that diversity and biodiversity that will allow us to have a big opportunity space in the event of unexpected outcomes. And so I draw our attention back to the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment, where those ecological services give us freedom of choice and action, opportunity to be able to achieve what an individual values doing and being. That's what nature gives us. And that's what we're going to need, because we will not predict what climate change is going to do to us in any 100% fashion. There's always going to be surprises coming up. So the diversity and biodiversity is important. It's not just about the numbers. I'll give you an example. I'm working with a graduate student on Vancouver Island marmots, the rarest mammal in North America. I'm trying to decide how to decide when they're healthy. Well, let's get them up to a certain number. They were down to 22 animals left only in the whole world. They started a captive breeding process. They got enough. They released them back out up to a few hundred. And they said, great, we've met the number we've wanted. We've got the number. And then they start crashing again because the number wasn't diverse. It wasn't diverse in the sex ratio. It wasn't diverse in the age ratio. It wasn't genetically diverse. Diversity is the cornerstone of adaptability. And that diversity is going to give us freshwater resources. It'll speed our recovery from natural disasters. It'll maintain balance in ecosystems. It'll help our sustainability, our food security. Soils and food chains from nature are all required on maintaining biodiverse nature. So to me, there's a public health role for advocacy for nature. Here's the sad state of affairs in Canada, right? 686 species at risk and endangered. 486 get legally listed protection, only 306 have a plan, and only 13 actually have an action plan. That's not action, that's an action plan. right? And for those of us in public health who want to create climate change health equity, this intergenerational health equity, need to make sure that we advocate for those raw materials in nature that provide a healthy environment. So environmental health specialists have to worry about the health of the environment to make sure the environment doesn't harm us or constrain what we can do. So climate change is going to put pressure on ecosystems. That's going to affect the ecosystem services. It'll affect us. We have the choice to respond. When I was at the climate change meeting in Florida, the choice there was, well, we'll build our way out of this. We'll engineer our way out of this. We'll put pumps. But that's a short-term solution. We need to have an ecosystem-based adaptation that will both mitigate against those effects by buffering against them, as well as supporting what we need in those ecological services, so we maintain those options to act, and we maintain all those functional social determinants that come from biodiversity. So building climate change health equity requires reciprocal care of nature and us. And I like this diagram about developing health equity, right? What do? Assess and report on the existence and impact of health inequities. In this case, it has to be health inequities across species. We have to modify and orient interventions and services to reduce inequities with an understanding of the unique needs of populations. Maybe it's a population of plants and forests that need to have our target to give those needs for daily living. Partner with other government and organizations to identify ways to improve health outcomes. And lead, support, and participate with other organizations in policy analysis and development, and in advocacy improvement in the determinants of health and inequities. And the question to you is, how can public health build intergenerational health equity without paying attention to nature? I can't see a way around it, because fundamentally, that's the problem. We are nature. And to think that we can isolate ourselves away from those fundamental services that provide our health and well-being is fooling ourselves. There's been a significant and important shift in public health towards the social determinants of health. And without a doubt, those are still critical. In my work in Canada and abroad, there are still great social justice issues and social inequities that reduce the resilience of, and health of communities and individuals. But we're doing that without recognizing you have to concurrently work at the environmental determinants of health as a positive health building operation and not just as a source of harm. And with that, I will take questions or comment, feedback from anybody.
Thank you very much, Dr. Craig Stevens, for that wonderful presentation. So we'll start with questions in the room first. Does anyone want to start, or any questions?
I have a question on the conservation side of what you were speaking about, because this issue of needing to conserve any number of things in order to provide some kind of an ecosystem services, so let us call it health. If climate change is causing changes in nature, changes in diversity, changes in composition of populations and communities, what are we conserving? And I'll use your example of salmon as a case in point. In an extreme case where salmon are declining because of rising temperatures, other species are coming in. You will have diversity. It will be a different diversity. Change is not a friend of the conservation community. And I'm just wondering how you address this issue of it's changing, you have to conserve something. How do you prioritize the conservation?
Conservation versus preservation are two different things, where people want to preserve the last of an example species. So the Vancouver Island marmot, for example, is an ice age remnant. Probably shouldn't be there anymore. Now, we've hastened its demise by logging its habitat, without a doubt. And so I guess the first thing is it's a philosophical question as much as a scientific question. If you believe in deep ecology, which is much more the spiritual side of ecology and the issues of inherent worth, you'll have a very different view than if you're talking about conservation from a natural resource management perspective. And so part of that depends on where you sit on the fence. Many of the people and students I've dealt with in conservation biology have been taught that people are only bad. So just as we've been taught nature is bad and scary. It's the same thing. What we need to do, I think, is actually harmonize those perspectives so that we can develop priorities together. I'm spending a lot of time right now thinking about adapting harm reduction approaches that we use for addictions to nature. I mean, we have an addiction to fossil fuels that is causing multiple harms across the species. And one of the first tenets of harm reduction is to collaboratively develop a vision of success. So I think our most important thing here is to try to guide a way that we can work together, because there will be shared aspects of diversity that are important to the conservation community, the public health community, the natural resource community. Until we have those conversations, we will pick the things that favor us the most. Yeah, David.
Climate change health equity across generations. What are your thoughts on sort of climate change health equity across different parts of the globe, in the sense that you start thinking about human migration as a consequence of climate change? I mean, a lot of these ecological and conserving scenarios involve, trying to keep the environment as pristine as possible. How do you balance that with the need of people in locations where perhaps climate change will have a greater effect moving north?
Yeah.
Have you been in conversations about that?
Well, I think
is the government thinking through that?
Is the government thinking through it, or have I thought about it? So first off, I'm not sure it's about maintaining pristine. I think the first question was important. It's about maintaining capacity to change, and that's going to change as situations change. Myself, philosophically, I believe I'm in third generation public health, because public health tends not to value future generations that much. Now, I recognize that the present generations, environmental protection is the luxury of the well-off, right? When I'm in Nepal, I mean, if I was living in some of those communities, I would eat the last of an endangered species, or I'd feed it to my child. So we recognize that the only way that we're going to be able to support environmental protection, which is a fundamental need for the survival of us as a species, you're going to have to deal with human well-being. The challenge to international development agencies right now is almost all of our strategies to deal with improving well-being is still based on fossil fuel-based economies. So they recognize to increase wealth and opportunities, and we're getting people to burn energy. So this is where the health equity team, the alternative energy engineer, may be as or more important than the sanitation, public health type of people. And so right now, I haven't seen anybody, I shouldn't say that. Right now, most of the conversation I've talked about is preparing for the big extreme, right? It's the same with our conservation. We don't invest in keeping the species that are doing well. We wait till they almost disappear and we react. Southern resident killer whales, northern right whales, there's a handful left. Now we invest in it instead of investing in those capacities that we need now. So I've had some interesting conversations with some international development agencies about how they can shift to a more ecological-based development that provides opportunities for communities to improve their welfare, so that they're in that position to have the abstract care for nature, so that we can provide that long-term well-being. Yeah.
I really like your talk. Thank you so much. And
thank you.
I'm kind of interested in your concept of reciprocal care. So right now we're dealing with our second norovirus oyster outbreak in a row, and all of the focus is on people becoming ill because they eat this one food commodity raw from the ocean, and all the focus is on our public health. And the underlying cause of this issue is us contaminating, the ocean with sewage. So how do we also talk about we need reciprocal care to the environment, because I'm sure that our discharge of effluent into the oceans is negatively affecting marine ecology, but that's not the trigger that I'll end up using to push change. It'll be, we can't pollute the oceans because it's going to make us sick if we eat raw oysters. Right. And then 99% of the population will say, oh, who cares, I don't eat raw oysters. So I don't know, how can we include that in a push for this harm reduction? And it's such a basic public health issue, we shouldn't be having primary effluent in our water.
Right. I think there's two quick answers that come to my mind. One is we need to invest in actually demonstrating the well-being of nature for our well-being. The Millennium Ecosystem Assessment did that, but we didn't pay attention to that much. It was more sort of a UN develop me sort of thing. In Canada, nobody has actually quantified the contribution of nature to our economy. Quick and dirty, it's as much as the agricultural economy or more, right? But we haven't actually explicitly focused on the benefits of nature because we've spent so much time describing the harms. CIHR likes to pay for harms and bad things and bells and whistles and, you know, litmus papers and PCR, as opposed to actually demonstrating how connections to the land is important to our well-being. So I think developing a research strategy and hiring those sorts of people who actually is, like we'll call them the third generation public health specialist, is one thing that could pragmatically be done to show the value. In the interim, lobby the new chief MHO to actually say that. To have the chief MHO to come out and say, just like she might come out and argue against smoking or argue against an overdose reduction, or argue for an overdose reduction strategy, should those public health leaders be seen to be giving that mission of advocacy that our health is important because of the health of the land around us, and that investing in that is a long-term public health strategy. So advocacy and evidence would be the argument I'd go through, and I see a lack of both these days.
Yeah.
There's one of the...
Yeah, so when I was a kid, the focus was very much on children starving in Africa, you know, overpopulation. Collectively, we've done very little to control the growth in the human population. As a microbiologist, you know, we're familiar with exponential growth and then a population crash. It seems to me that a lot of the effects that we're seeing, the global warming, everything else that you talked about, is fundamentally related to this exponential growth in human population, and it seems to have slipped off, you know, off the table and under the radar. And do you have anything to say for that? Because I'm very pessimistic from that point of view.
Well, a couple of things. One,
can I just add, there's a similar question online as well, so I just want to let the person online know that there's also a question in their room about human population control.
When I was first year at BC CDC, when go to the rounds out at UBC, population was a huge conversation, discussion in public health. And I asked somebody a while ago why it dropped off, and part of it is respect for not preaching to people what they should do with their own lives and their own body. It hasn't, but at the same time, you're right, exponential growth is going up, and that's the source of all of our problems. Is not just the numbers, but the choices we make with those numbers, our ecological footprint. Now, having said that, you've got two options: give up, enjoy, die a brilliant life, right? Don't worry about my grandkid, don't worry about my great-grandkid, and away we go. We're doomed anyways. The other is to begin to give a message of optimism and something you can do, which is why I'm leaning towards the harm reduction approach. I can't stop climate change. Can I at least make it more tolerable? And if we are going to demise, maybe delay it till, I maybe don't care about my 7th generation. I might care about my great-grand. You know what I mean? Like, so when I remember talking to my son when the last elections came on, and he's 28 now, so he was in his 20s, and the party, the Conservative Party at that time, very much had a message of fear in their campaign. And we were having the discussion of if fear was because, you know, old people get afraid of crime, and I said to him, "Are you more afraid than me?" Thinking he'd say, "Well, no, Dad." He said, "Yeah." I said, "Well, why is that?" He said, "I've grown up in a generation where information is always available, it's always bad, and nobody offers a solution." So it's the same with environmental health. We're excellent at finding, describing problems. And the solutions we have tend to be technological quick fixes. But we have disempowered a generation by not giving them a message of hope. So I think we need to change the conversation against, yes, we're in the Titanic and the iceberg is exponential growth rate. Who and what do we need to have in those lifeboats so that after we hit that iceberg, the human species could survive and thrive? And of course, the less diversity we have in the world around us, the less tools we're going to have to adapt to later on. So yes, it seems an inevitable thing. Can we delay it? Can we slow it? Can we reverse it? We have to start giving a message of optimism, or everybody's going to check out, because we are disenfranchising a generation right now.
Thank you. Great talk you have given. this climate change impacting on the health of the people, and the public health in the public health setting. What I see, I've been a vet epidemiologist for many years in the past. For past about 3 years, I'm in the chronic disease, non-communicable disease area. What I see is, especially take the example of British Columbia, the provincial budget, 45% of the provincial budget is allocated for health. Out of that, 80% of the budget goes to manage chronic disease, non-communicable disease. And these don't have any causative agent, particularly like communicable disease would have. And only way to reduce them, the burden of these diseases, is through the preventions. And what you are talking about, all these are so relevant to that prevention piece. However, the political climate is that the acute care is always overwhelming, and politicians, or you talk about chief medical health officer or chief public health officer working on that. Actually, they want to do it, but still political climate is that. They have to focus on acute care, which is the prime important. Every day, people's life is so important. So what I see is all relevant pieces that we have talked about: climate change, intergenerational work within the diversity, enhancing the diversity for everything we need: food, water, and the way we live and play. At the end of the day, all this happens in the community, and that piece of community engagement we need to do in a shared way, just like the One Health concept that is going around. More on the non-communicable side, there's still the engagement piece is very much lacking. How do you see, from your perspective, from your experience, how can we make that engagement, community engagement, towards these directions where the bulk of the health burden lies? Can we focus on?
The short answer is beer and pizza. In other words, you got to make friends with people outside of the health sphere, right? There's health policy and there's healthy policy. Most of the things that we need to do to build resilience for climate change are outside of the Ministry of Health. So we need to figure out how to develop alliances and collaborations so that you can most effectively advocate for and direct other people's money. It's like I was told, my old mentor told me, the sign of a great epidemiologist is the ability to steal other people's data and be thanked for it in the end. The sign of a great climate change preparedness person is to steal other people's resources and be thanked for it in the end, right? Much of the stuff we're talking about is under the umbrella of forestry and fisheries. I had a meeting with the Department of Fisheries and Oceans yesterday, advocating for just this sort of work in their domain, and they're very interested. So alliances, advocacy, and partnerships, and recognizing that disease is the job of specialists in the Ministry of Health. Health is a team sport that crosses ministries, but it needs to be somebody's job to make those alliances and make those teams and have them function together. So you need to invest in that super connector whose job it is just to find out, what are you doing? What are you doing? How can you help? Here's my priorities. Where do we work together? Which again, is like the harm reduction approach. That's sort of split across a variety of non-human domains.
Do you see any role for like directly intervening in wildlife health? So I'm thinking about like white nose syndrome's killing all the bats. I was out in White Rock and all of the sea stars have gone.
Yep.
They used to be everywhere and they got killed by a virus. I mean, you could probably design an attenuated virus or an attenuated fungus, go out and infect the bats before they get infected with the deadly strain, and maybe build up immunity. Same with other wildlife. Nature ought to be, a self-regulating mechanism, but it's been so badly damaged. Are we at a point where we need to start stepping in and taking over some of the core functions of the
So there's a pragmatic answer first. If we think about what you can do for disease in animal populations, kill them all. We do that for things like foot and mouse. Selective slaughter, isolate and quarantine, mass vaccination, mass treatment, environmental manipulations. We have one mass vaccine that's effective and can work because it's hard to find the animals to vaccinate in a vaccine that they'll take up orally that gets enough herd immunity. Society won't demand or won't support mass culls or even test and slaughters. Mass treatment, the same problem with delivery. On top of that, the regulatory regime, I just had one of my staff do a review of what it would take to use a biological or chemical approach to white nose syndrome in bats, and the red tape, you know, the epidemic's over. Fundamentally, which is why I'm a health guy, fundamentally, we need to make sure they have the capacity to recover. We need to make sure they have those needs for daily living. And if we can, my worry about going to the biotechnological quick fix is that we don't then focus on those fundamental needs for health because, oh, we got a vaccine, right? So it's a double-edged sword in that it's sexy, and if it could work, it would be great. People are chasing a vaccine for chronic wasting disease in deer. They'll never get it out because those prions have contaminated the prairies, right? What do we do in the interim? So let somebody chase that vaccine, but until we it's no different to us, right? You can't have your health by taking stuff out of a bottle. You got to have a good home and a good family and food, all that sort of stuff. We need that same ethic into wildlife health, I believe.
Okay, great. Thank you, everyone. So we're out of time, and that's it for the questions. There's no more questions online, so thank you very much for coming, and have a great day.
Thank you.